Hey all, it's Miss Matthews. Today we are going to be looking at mid-19th century American presidencies. So we are going to be looking at presidents 6 through 10, John Quincy Adams, Andrew Jackson, Martin Van Buren, William Henry Harrison, and John Tyler. So some questions to consider. How did the electorate, or the people who could vote for president, begin to change after the era of good feelings? What is the corrupt bargain? What is the spoils system? And finally, how did the concept of nullification influence domestic policy or policy that we see in the United States during the 1830s? So, some key terms on this slide. Again, keep these in mind as you are watching the video. So, we start to see a lot of changes to the electorate, or who can vote, sort of moving into the 1820s. The earlier presidencies, we sort of really see that candidates are picked by Congress, sort of in back rooms. The people who can vote are wealthy property owners. We see the beginnings of American democracy are very much rooted in the upper classes. Sort of the common man doesn't have a whole lot of say in government. And we start to see that change in the 1820s. We start to see politicians sort of make an increased effort to appeal to the masses rather than a select group of people, sort of as more people gain the right to vote. And when we're talking about the people who are gaining the right to vote, we are talking about white males. There had been a property requirement for a long time to vote. That's not something that we just see in the United States. We do see sort of a callback to what we see in Europe. But we really start to see, especially with the rise of the Industrial Revolution in the United States, that universal white male suffrage or voting is increasingly the norm. It's increasingly the norm rather than just having those property requirements. And we start to see that the South is actually the last region to grant that universal white male suffrage. We see that the northern states and western states tend to adopt that policy pretty quickly, but it takes the South a while to come around to that. We see that these new voters demand politicians represent common people's interests. We see the members of the Electoral College, which is the group that elects the president even today, instead of having those electors be selected by state legislatures, more and more we see that those individuals are being chosen by the people. We see it during this time that the rise of nominating conventions are being used to select presidential nominees rather than sort of those backdoor meetings in Congress, sort of deciding who the nominee would be. And these nominating conventions are something that we see to this day. We did have nominating conventions in 2016. We will continue this tradition in 2020. And sort of this rise of voting rights for white males, this attention to the common people's interests, we can kind of refer to this as Jacksonian democracy, named for President Andrew Jackson. And Jacksonian democracy really champions the rights of the common man and really opposed any sort of aristocracy or upper class in the nation. So Jacksonian democracy sort of becomes the go-to ideology during this time. So we are going to pick up with the election of 1824. You might remember from the previous video that the election of 1820 is really unique in that we sort of see James Monroe runs unopposed, and we sort of call that the era of good feelings, sort of that bitter rivalry between Democratic, Republicans, and Federalists has sort of faded away. We've got sort of one person competing for the presidency, but that does not last. That does not last. In the election of 1824, we see 4 different candidates run for president. We see Andrew Jackson, Henry Clay, William Crawford, and then John Quincy Adams. And sort of coming out of this era of good feelings, all 4 of these men were considered sort of Democratic Republicans, because we sort of see the Federalist Party dies sort of in like 1816. We see James Monroe run unopposed. So we're sort of still in this era of good feelings. So all 4 of these candidates are technically considered Democratic Republicans. We see Andrew Jackson actually gets the most votes. He gets the most votes in the popular election, but he doesn't get a majority of the electoral vote. He did not sort of reach the threshold needed to sort of declare him the outright winner. So this election gets kicked to the House of Representatives. The 12th Amendment says that the House of Representatives must choose a president from those top 3 finishers if no one wins the majority of votes. So you might think that this is a no-brainer. Andrew Jackson sort of wins most of the popular vote. He is the one who should be elected president. However, Henry Clay, who is one of the men running for the presidency, he finishes 4th in the election, which means he is not one of those top 3 that the House of Representatives is going to look at to decide who is president. But Henry Clay, at this point, is the Speaker of the House, sort of the highest ranking member in Congress. And because he is Speaker of the House, he decides and he oversees sort of the process of selecting the next president, which is 100% in no way, shape, or form a conflict of interest. So Henry Clay finishes 4th, is tasked with sort of overseeing this selection process, and Henry Clay despises Andrew Jackson. He sees him as a rival. Both Henry Clay and Andrew Jackson are from those new Western states. Henry Clay sees him as a rival, and there is no way that he is going to let Andrew Jackson become president. And John Quincy Adams supports his American plan, his American system. And so Henry Clay convinces most people in the House of Representatives to elect John Quincy Adams as president. He sort of really uses his influence to make sure that Jackson does not become president. So Jackson wins the most electoral votes, wins the most popular votes, but just not enough. The election goes to the House of Representatives, and all of a sudden, John Quincy Adams is the 6th president of the United States. A couple of days later, John Adams announces Henry Clay as his Secretary of State. Again, in no way, shape, or form a conflict of interest. So we see Jackson and his supporters start to call this the corrupt bargain, this idea that Henry Clay makes sure John Quincy Adams becomes the president, but then John Quincy Adams, when he is the president, sort of returns the favor and makes Henry Clay the Secretary of State. So John Quincy Adams only served one term in office. He is the son of the second president of the United States, John Adams. He had served as Secretary of State under James Monroe. And what we're going to see with Adams's presidency is it's plagued by increasing sectionalism and sort of the fracturing of the Democratic Republican Party. So the first thing we see in John Adams's presidency is this tariff of abominations. Now, protective tariffs have sort of been an integral part of the U.S. economy since 1816, when we start to see the American system put in place. And we see a couple of different tariffs come into play to try and protect the U.S. economy from foreign competitors, specifically Great Britain. And these tariffs really help northern states. It helps protect their manufacturing business. And northern states want to increase the tariff to 45% from 37% in 1828. And Congress does. Congress approves this tariff. But southern states saw this tariff as an abomination, as it would force them to buy more expensive northern goods rather than cheaper British goods, because those British goods without the tariff are cheaper. But once that tariff is slapped on, those northern goods, which are more expensive to begin with, end up becoming cheaper. So the South ends up paying more for goods either way. And this tariff of 1828, this tariff of abominations, is protested by John C. Calhoun, who is a South Carolinian, and also Adams as vice president. And he writes in secret this South Carolina exposition. And what's important to note about the South Carolina exposition is that it reintroduces this idea of nullification as a means to defy national law. Remember, nullification is this idea that states do not have to abide by national law if they feel that law is unconstitutional. It was introduced in the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, during the Alien and Sedition Act, fiasco under John Adams, the second president. But it mostly just sort of goes away. But this South Carolina exposition reintroduces this idea of nullification, basically saying we should not have to follow this tariff because we feel it is unconstitutional. But no other states protest that tariff. So moving on to the election of 1828, it is a rematch between John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson. And this is the reemergence of a two-party system after that era of good feelings. We saw in the election of 1824 that all four candidates were sort of considered these Democratic Republicans, but under John Quincy Adams's presidency, that fully fractures, and the Democratic Republicans are sort of no more. We see that John Quincy Adams runs as a national Republican, and Jackson runs as a Democrat. The same Democratic Party that we see today. National Republicans accused Jackson's wife of being a bigamist, meaning that she married Jackson while she was still married to another man. This fact is true. She did marry Andrew Jackson while she was married to someone else. We see that this election is sort of really full of mudslinging. Andrew Jackson is still very bitter about losing the presidency in 1824. And we see Andrew Jackson sort of soundly defeats Adams in the Electoral College. And Jackson's support really comes from the West, South, and then laborers on the East Coast. And they sort of refer to the election of 1828 as a revolution, because no sitting president had ever been removed since the first John Adams in 1800, meaning no president who had sort of run for an additional term had ever been beaten. So like father, like son. So some interesting things about Andrew Jackson. Served 2 terms. He was a general in the War of 1812. He's the first president from the West, so those new Western states that are forming west of the Appalachian Mountains. And he's sort of seen as this great common man, when in actuality, he owns one of the largest plantations in the West, owns many, many slaves, which is a sign of wealth. He was in sort of no way, shape, or form a common man. He sought to reduce the role of federal government, sort of similarly to Thomas Jefferson. He's given the nickname of King Andrew. He frequently abused presidential powers. He defied the will of Congress and the Supreme Court frequently. He very much sort of did what he wanted, sort of no matter what people tried to do. Andrew Jackson introduces this idea of the spoil systems, the spoil system, which really is the practice of rewarding your political supporters with public offices, sort of regardless of their merit. This is something that we've sort of seen since then. Andrew Jackson sort of sets the precedent for rewarding political supporters with government positions. Jackson fired nearly 10% of the federal employees after becoming president, and he replaces them with individuals that are loyal to him. And he sort of sets this precedent for clean sweeps that we see a lot of individuals in high-level positions in the federal government usually resign after a presidential election to allow the president to appoint somebody or maybe even reappoint them to positions, sort of giving the president a clean slate to start out a new term, whether or not that president had been in power before. And what we're going to see with the spoils system is it very much leads to political corruption, people trying to curry favor with the president in order to sort of reap the benefits of being a federal employee. So Andrew Jackson did quite a bit when it comes to domestic policy. One of the first things that we see is another tariff. So again, tariffs have sort of played a really big role in the U.S. economy since James Madison, and Andrew Jackson wanted to lower the tariff, not get rid of the tariff, but at least lower the tariff of abominations, the tariff of 1828, to appease the South. He sort of recognized that the South was upset and wanted to reduce that tariff. Now, South Carolina, who, John C. Calhoun had been Adams's vice president. He was Jackson's vice president as well for a term. His home state of South Carolina, at this point, rather than just threatening to nullify the law, actually go through with nullification of the tariff, and actually threatened to secede from the Union over it. And so Congress came together and sort of revamped that tariff to reduce it from 35% to 25% over sort of 10 years, to appease South Carolina and the southern states. And we see that South Carolina does rescind that nullification order. But we start to see that South Carolina is willing to use that nullification theory in order to sort of preserve their rights as a state. Another thing that Andrew Jackson does is he begins the process of removing indigenous Americans from their ancestral homeland. We do still see a lot of indigenous groups living in states, living in Georgia and Alabama, North Carolina, Mississippi, in the territory of Florida. And we start to see Andrew Jackson sort of come to sort of gets in his head that these groups of people cannot be assimilated into American culture, and thus they need to be removed from what is the United States. And so he passes the Indian Removal Act, and this is forced removal of remaining American Indians in established states to what is known as Indian Territory. We can think of it as modern-day Oklahoma. More than 100,000 American Indians are forcibly removed to Oklahoma. Many of them die along the way. And what's interesting to note is the Supreme Court recognizes the Cherokee Nation's autonomy and the recognizes that they should be allowed to stay on their land. And Andrew Jackson blatantly defies that Supreme Court order and continued with removal. So we see Andrew Jackson just straight up ignoring the Supreme Court. So Andrew Jackson also had an issue with the Bank of the United States. Sort of at the core of his economic policy was removing government interference from the economy. He wanted them completely separate. He did not want government interfering with the economy in any way. And he saw the bank as a interference. He saw the bank as an interference with the economy. And the bank's charter was not up for renewal until 1836. But National Republicans wanted it to be a campaign issue in 1832 when he was running against Henry Clay. So National Republicans and Congress sort of pushed for it to be reviewed earlier. Jackson had called the bank, quote, monopolistic and unconstitutional, even though the constitutionality of the bank had been decided by the Supreme Court. In 1819, the Supreme Court said, yes, the Bank of the United States is constitutional. There is nothing unconstitutional about it. But again, Andrew Jackson does not like listening to the Supreme Court, and thus he vetoes the bus's charter in 1832. He is able to convince the general public to think of it as a privileged institution that is elitist. And so the Bank of the United States is killed by Andrew Jackson, and that's actually going to have a pretty big impact on the economy in the coming years. So the election of 1832 pitted Andrew Jackson against Henry Clay. Henry Clay is one of those people who has run for president many, many times and never becomes president. Jackson favored sort of 1 term, but was convinced to run again by people who profited greatly off of his presidency. And we see Andrew Jackson is still very well liked, and he ends up defeating Clay pretty handedly in the Electoral College. But one thing to note about the election of 1832, we see a lot of things come into play here. First, we see sort of the introduction of a third party. It's for the first time in American history that sort of competes at the presidential level. We see the anti-Masonic party is in the mix, and they are sort of the first third party that runs a candidate, and we will see that third parties sort of pop up here and there throughout American history. We see national nominating conventions are organized by all three parties to sort of, again, return the power of government to the people. And then finally, the anti-Masonics and the National Republicans have formal party platforms, or what their party stands for. So, election of 1836, Andrew Jackson decides he is too old to run for another term and hand picks Martin Van Buren, who had been his Secretary of State and also his vice president, to be his successor. And we see the formation of a new party in 1836, the Whig Party. This is sort of a group of people who are very much against Jackson and what he is doing. And the Whig Party sort of forms in direct opposition to him. We see that the National Republicans sort of get absorbed into the Whig Party. And because the party was so new, they ran 4 different candidates against Martin Van Buren. They sort of couldn't decide on one. So we see William Henry Harrison, Hugh White, Daniel Webster, and Willie Mangum all run against Martin Van Buren. And Van Buren defeats Harrison pretty handedly in the Electoral College. Even though there were 4 people running against Martin Van Buren, William Henry Harrison was sort of the quote-unquote official Whig Party candidate. And what's significant about the election of 1836 is it sort of reestablishes the second party system. We're going to see the Democrats versus the Whigs for a pretty long time, sort of leading into the second half of the 19th century. That first party system had been Democratic, Republicans, and Federalists. So Martin Van Buren, he is Andrew Jackson's hand-picked successor. He served as Jackson's Secretary of State and Vice President. He's a founder of the Democratic Party, and one of his major political goals in life was to reestablish a two-party system with partisan differences based on ideology. So he was very much in favor of a two-party system. So Martin Van Buren is a one-term president, mostly because of the Panic of 1837. So shortly after he takes office, we start to see a financial crisis start that sort of sets off a major recession in the United States that lasts until about the mid-1840s. And this panic is actually partially caused by the killing of the Bank of the United States by Jackson in 1832. The bust did sort of heavily ground the United States economy, and sort of taking that away has a pretty big impact on other financial institutions in the United States. So we start to see that investors are borrowing a lot of money to buy land out west, to invest in canals and roads and enslaved individuals, sort of during this manufacturing boom, during westward expansion. We see a lot of people really trying to capitalize and make money on all of these good things that are happening in the United States. But those investors could not pay back loans. And when banks couldn't get those loans paid back, it causes those banks to fail and sort of not have enough money to continue in operation. And we start to see the banks that are still around are worried about the paper money that is being printed. And we see that in 1837, some banks stop accepting paper currency and start to set off this panic and this recession. And so this recession lasts throughout Van Buren's presidency into the 1840s. And we see that American banks begin collapsing by the hundreds. When the Bank of the United States was vetoed, we see a lot of banks sort of just pop up all over the place to fill that void. However, none of those banks necessarily have the capital to stay operational when hard times hit. So we see American banks collapse by the thousands. Many Americans lost their savings. We see businesses close, those factories close, and unemployment rates soar. So needless to say, Martin Van Buren is a one-term president. So he does run again in the election of 1840, and he runs against William Henry Harrison. The Whigs finally figure it out. They select William Henry Harrison again as their nominee, and this is sort of the first mass turnout election in American history. We see many, many, many more people coming out to the polls to cast their vote. This is also the first time we start to see a lot of propaganda and silly slogans sort of come out and be used as a campaign tool. We, again, still see a lot of this propaganda and sort of silly slogans to help people sort of remember candidate names. So we see Whigs sort of create this false mythology around Harrison being a poor farmer from a log cabin, when in actuality he's from a very wealthy family in Virginia. So it's trying to paint him as sort of this common man, this everyman. And then Harrison and the Whig vice president, John Tyler, use this slogan, Tippecanoe and Tyler too. Harrison had been a war hero in the War of 1812, had fought at the Battle of Tippecanoe. So we see that this silly slogan comes into effect, and that slogan, it works. And Harrison defeats Van Buren, again, pretty handedly in the Electoral College to become the 9th President of the United States. William Henry Harrison was president for all of 31 days. He contracts pneumonia during his inauguration, hangs on for 31 days, and then dies. Funny caveat to this story is he still holds the record for holding the longest inaugural address in history. So spending all of that time outside without a coat, giving this very long speech, ultimately led to his demise. But even though he was only president for 31 days, his death actually sparks this constitutional crisis regarding succession. Never before had we had a president die in office, and although we have the office of the vice presidency, there is still sort of a question of what happens if a president is unable to complete his term. So John Tyler is becomes the accidental president. He becomes president after William Henry Harrison's death, and his ascension to the presidency from the vice presidency really sets the precedent for how the transfer of power from a vice president to becoming president is sort of established. So even though the precedent isn't sort of put into law until the 25th Amendment, many, many years later, we do see that this is sort of the first time that a president dies in office, and we sort of see this vice president sort of step into that role smoothly. So John Tyler had many, many struggles during his one term as president. He is dubbed his accidency by the Whigs, since it was never intended for him to become president. You know, the Whigs put forth William Henry Harrison. They just sort of put John Tyler on there too. But it was never intended for him to become president. And the Whigs start to have many, many problems with John Tyler. His actions as president were more in keeping with the Democratic Party. He sort of did a lot of things that really upset the Whigs, like vetoing bills to create the national bank again, to raise the tariff rates, sort of key parts of the Whig platform. And it upset the Whigs so much that they ended up expelling him from the party. We see that he's the first president to see his veto of legislation overridden by Congress, meaning Congress came together and voted over a veto. He has some successes in foreign policy. We see the Webster-Ashburton Treaty with Great Britain that resolves some outstanding border issues. And we see that the Treaty of Shanghai with China, which sort of establishes some trade relationships and some legal relationships with China. Even though the Whigs and the Democrats really couldn't agree on anything, they did agree that neither of them wanted to have a second Tyler term, and both refused to endorse him for the presidency in 1844. So John Tyler had quite a few struggles as president, but he sort of ends his presidency in 1844. So some key takeaways: we sort of see that a second party system emerges after Federalists and Democrats sort of die out. We see the Democrats and the Whigs really sort of step into the role of a two-party system. We see that many new precedents are established, and this idea of nullification that was first introduced in the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions is reintroduced by South Carolina to challenge tariffs. So I know this was a long video. Thanks for sticking with me. I will see you next time.